So just a very brief introduction to this, Mohan had invited me to do one of the lectures in the lecture series he had last year on, the impact of COVID-19 on a variety of phases of life, especially because he is in health comm and anything that is connected with communication and COVID-19. And so he had a series of lectures that he presented, he collated it across the world, and he was presenting it through his CARE forum and platform. And when November rolled around and, I was thinking of what I want to submit for ICA, I wanted to do something a little bit more with regard to how COVID-19 is also not just associated with health communication from the perspective of just, degrees of information with regard to, or inequity of information, but it touches people's lives in other forms of inequities as well. And that's where the key concept for this particular panel came about. And as you will see that Mohan has talked about. Mohan, do you want to talk very briefly about your presentation?
Sure. So
just a one-liner,
yes,
two-liner.
One-liner. So I talk about Islamophobia in India, authoritarian neoliberalism, and the ways in which that folds into COVID-19 management or mismanagement rather in India.
Yeah, and I looked at the various, rhetoric surrounding COVID-19 and how originally many of the leaders around the world were blaming immigrants for bringing it to their borders, or, using the COVID-19 as a justification to stop immigration, migration, or vilify immigrants and migrants in various ways. And I looked at 5 different leaders across the world who were already coming from very conservative, very right-wing parties, and who were, kind of almost weaponizing the COVID-19 rhetoric against immigrants, migrants. So my paper talks about that. And Jace, do you want to speak a little bit about your paper?
Yes, so my work is about the COVID-19 racist-related disinformation here in the Philippines, and particularly how it complicates the idea of who does racist disinformation, because here it's a little bit of the reverse. Our authoritarian government is strongly aligned with China, and so seems like it's being anti-racist, and the opposition finding no other way to challenge the very stronghold of our authoritarian regime is falling into the trap of using racist discourse. So these complications about who is to be blamed for the amplification, particularly of the long-standing complex relationship between Filipinos, the Chinese nationals living here, and the Filipinos with Chinese descent as well.
So with that, these are the 3 papers that were included. And we had another paper that was supposed to be included, but and it was coming from another very, very awesome scholar, Gavan Titli, but he was not able to submit his, paper because he had some personal issues at the last minute around the time that the videos were to be submitted. So he kind of withdrew his paper. So it's just the 3 of us, Devina. You want to take it from here?
So Sudeshna, did you want me to play the videos now?
That's what I was, who is going to play the video? I thought that it was the Hyderabad folks, or are you guys?
Either ways, Devina,
Okay.
do you want us to play?
Yes, please, yes.
It would, I think it would be better if you played Mohan, just in case, because we've had internet issues here. So.
Okay, sounds good. Welcome. So I'm playing Sudeshna, your presentation first.
Hi, this is Sudeshna Roy. I am here to talk about my paper that is Immigrants, Border Restrictions, and Racism, Authoritarian Impulses in the Guise of Coronavirus Response. I am a professor at Stephen F. Austin State University in Texas and happy to be part of this panel. My paper is specifically looking at how COVID-19 responses in certain parts of the world that have seen the rise of right-wing politics and are led by leaders who have these nationalistic tendencies, that will disproportionately affect immigrants, migrants, and other types of people who have constant mobility in their world as a strategy to survive even, and that it is not going to go away right after the pandemic ends. It's going to stay. I will start off today's talk by talking about how the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres talks about the pandemic continues to unleash a tsunami of hate and xenophobia, scapegoating and scaremongering that included many examples of migrants and refugees being vilified as a source of the virus when the pandemic started. And this is very true. As you will see in today's examples that I provide, this is something that is happening throughout the world, and they are being vilified. So the key questions that are being investigated in this paper is how do narratives of immigrant mobilities function within the dominant discourses of COVID-19 responses, and what key messages and discursive strategies can be identified in the COVID-19 responses from right-wing leaders and political parties. And how a crisis shapes, talks and discourses about immigrants, migrants is not new. What COVID-19 is bringing to the forefront is the question of mobility. So what is happening here is that people are, what has happened before is that, for example, when Europe has been facing the Syrian refugee crisis, European leaders talked about European identity, in response to the escalation, acceleration, and diversification of migrant and refugee mobilities. And this has been talked at length with, in Genoa's work, or, how in a capitalist, patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric, modern colonial world system, there are zones of being and non-being based on race, which is Gross-Fogel et al.'s work. And one of those zones of non-being are borderlands. Other works have talked about how whiteness moves. So Karma Chavez's work in 2013 talks about how whiteness moves with casual disregard for its effects on other bodies. And in this case, all of the things that are being done to protect the white population within the countries that are taking, actions against migrants and immigrants, and how that protection is actually working against the, bodies of color. So I'll start off with a comparative analysis between the US and the Europe, and specific countries in Europe where right-wing politics is thriving. So for example, US, had severe border control since late March, so 2020 late March. They curbed immigration, the ban even covered application for green card. So having said that, I'm going to look at the previous president who has had longer period of time dealing with COVID than the current president, Biden. I'm going to talk about how Trump spoke about this. And he specifically talked about, we want to protect our US workers. He talked about by pausing immigration, we will put Americans first in line for jobs as America reopens. Short break from new immigration will protect the solvency of our healthcare system to almost, say that the healthcare system is being overwhelmed by immigrants and migrants. And he also planned to sign a temporary suspension of immigration into the United States, but at that time he didn't do it. And then, of course, he said Mexico is partly to blame for COVID-19 surges, and none of that is proven by any facts. But Trump's loyal supporters, obviously lapped this up, and he received 70 million votes in the last November election. But you can see that his discursive strategies were to protect our people, the economic well-being of citizens, which excludes permanent residents, which are the green card holders, the fear of the unknown, and the racist immigration-related comments that distracted from his other failures, So selective immigration for those willing to do low-paying jobs. For example, he allowed agricultural migrants to continue to do their work, people who came and did short-term agricultural work from Mexico. In Europe, the situation was slightly different. Obviously, you can see that there is a major rise in nationalism in Europe in the last decade. And some of the immigrant jobs, for example, cleaners and helpers have extra EU jobs, maximum percentages. So the lowest paying jobs are going to the immigrants and migrants. And some of the responses that I'm going to talk about are from Italy, Germany, and Hungary. In Italy, for example, the right-wing leader, Matteo Salvini, still really enjoys much support. And it's really, a support based on how the migrant population of Libya is taking up our jobs. The health and living condition of the migrants are, secondary, and it obviously will be disproportionately affected. And the emergence of this Italianness that is very important to this right-wing leader. In Germany, for example, there was a protest that was organized, and I'm showing you the actual photograph from the protest, where they said that the far right were being marginalized. And with the reopening, there were new strategies that they were moving forward that would be more Islamophobic, and that they were saying that immigrants are leveraging their unemployment to the detriment of Germans. And in Hungary, for example, European leader, Prime Minister Viktor Orban seeked and was granted a power to rule by decree to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. And he actually did stop that. I think the parliament stopped that sometime in October, but within that time frame, he did construct what he said he wanted to construct, an illiberal state. So if you contrast the European right-wing discursive strategies with the American one, you would see that the Europeans leaders were spreading more misinformation. They were talking about very nationalistic tropes like us versus them, using unemployment, resource protection. They were also playing a lot of identity politics. We are Germans, we are Hungarians, we are not them. And there were a lot of metaphors of war that were used in some of those dialogues some of those discourses that I analyzed. So I'm going to talk just a little bit for the short-term and the long-term consequences. The short-term consequences are that populist politicians are painting asylum seekers and irregular migrants as threats to the containment of the virus. And then discourses of politicians are creating a very narrow understanding of what and who they are to their national audience. On the other hand, the long-term consequences can be very, very disproportionate, discouraging to immigrants and migrants. For example, their future conditions and adaptation will be potentially affected at structural level, at the cultural level, like people talking about them and not accepting them in any form within the dominant culture, and at the discursive level, having very narrow conceptions of who they are. And then, government actions with regard to, say, healthcare, with regard to legality, with regard to police protection, all of those things might have long-term consequences with this, blockade against them and all of these talks against them. And then, of course, media portrayals might be different and leading to changing race relations, changing host culture receptivity to certain people. So as final thoughts, it is very difficult to forecast what will happen post-pandemic, because, this could be an aberration that these people use these types of discourses only for the sake of the pandemic, because the pandemic does place increased demands on scarce resources. But discourses of resistance against authoritarian impulses can be attempted by undertaking a very culture-centered approach to immigrant narratives, something that could be done by talking about how, culturally, people bring goodwill, people can do things differently, people bring a different way of approaching differences. And, health communication relies not only on a well-functioning health system with universal coverage, but also on social inclusion, justice, and solidarity. And all of those can be done through a culture-centered approach. So I'll finish my talk here, and I look forward to your comments during the ICA time. Thank you so much.
We are going to move to the next presentation, which is Jason's presentation.
Hello, I'm Jason Cabanes, an associate professor in communication at Salle University in Manila in the Philippines. And in this video, I'm going to talk about my paper entitled The Imaginative Dimension of Pandemic Disinformation on COVID-19 Fake News and Social Narratives of Inter-Asian Cross-Cultural Relations. In this brief presentation, I want to emphasize that to have a more nuanced understanding of the social dynamics of COVID-19 related disinformation on anti-Asian racism in global North countries like the USA, one has to go beyond the contexts of these countries. Whilst there are many things to unpack, here I particularly complicate the idea of solidarity across people of color, and in particular amongst Asian migrants. This is because their communities are entangled in long-standing cross-cultural dynamics that go well beyond the West. As a reference point for such transnational social dynamics, I turn to the Philippines, the country of origin and/or heritage of at least 4.1 million people in the USA. This country is a meaningful prism to look at digital disinformation, the COVID-19 pandemic, and inter-Asian cross-cultural relations. First, the Philippines continues to be a global innovator of digital disinformation strategies, unfortunately. A big tech leader even colorfully described it as the patient zero in the global disinformation epidemic. Second, the country has also been at the epicenter of COVID-19. It is doubly unfortunate, a leader in the number of active cases and deaths in what the World Health Organization labels as the Western Pacific region. Finally, and crucial to this presentation, the country is a post-colony with a long history of complicated inter-Asian racisms. And here I want to zero in particularly on the relationships between Filipinos and Chinese. In this presentation, I want to begin teasing out the imaginative dimension of how digital disinformation has mediated the country's pandemic-related racism. In a recently published paper in Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, I define this imaginative dimension as being about the cultural, emotional, and narratival roots of fake news and political trolling online. Builds on the work of scholars like Christopher Anderson and Daniel Kreis, who argue that central to the persuasive power of digital disinformation is that they engage with powerful social narratives that people hold on to. If you want to read up on that work a little bit more, you may scan the QR code that you can see on the screen at the moment. Now, for this particular presentation, the most relevant of such social narratives is what the sociologist Arlie Hochschild calls deep stories. These are the stories that people tell themselves about who they are, what values they hold, and ultimately what their place in society is. my intent is to start establishing what deep stories locals in the Philippines capital of Manila draw on when they encounter digital disinformation about COVID-19 and the recent influx of Chinese nationals in the city, many of whom are said to be working for Chinese-owned Philippine offshore gaming operators, also called as POGOs. What makes pandemic-related racist disinformation in the Philippines complicated is how the country's political camps are positioned vis-a-vis the Chinese government. The current administration of President Rodrigo Duterte has a pro-China stance, whilst those opposed to the government have an anti-China stance. This means that with the issue of racism, the often demonized authoritarian-leaning and populist Duterte government appears to be in the defense of China and by extension, the Chinese nationals in Manila. Take for instance this comment that you have here on the screen, asking for sympathy for the plight of Chinese nationals, particularly during the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in the Philippines when they were supposed to be feeling othered. This fake news material that you see here was copy-pasted all over Facebook by those supporting the government. Meanwhile, the supporters of the anti-government camp, prominently led by the supposedly liberal technocrats, sometimes cross the line and extend their anti-China stance to become an anti-Chinese nationals stance. Take a look at this Facebook comment to Chinese business people giving out face masks to residents in Manila. Echoing anti-Chinese trolls, this local commenter says that the Chinese can keep the face masks and that they should leave and return to China. One can say that this is partly out of sheer frustration that no critique seems to stick to Teflon Duterte and his populist political performance. The data I'll talk about are from an ongoing series of ethnographic interviews with local residents of Manila from across the political spectrum. This is part of a broader project funded by the Consortium on Democracy and Disinformation that also includes a comparative set of interviews with residents of Masbate, a much smaller provincial city in the Bicol region. As I and my research team have only completed 10 of the 15 interviews we have set out to do in Manila for now, I can only sketch out indications of the imaginative dimension that underpins how digital disinformation has mediated COVID-19 related racism in the city. Since I don't have much time in this video, let me focus on one deep story that seems to be playing a role in our research participants' engagement with pro and anti-government fake news and trolling about COVID-19 and the Chinese nationals living in Manila. This is the narrative of distrust towards the Chinese government that unfortunately sometimes extends to a distrust towards Chinese nationals and at times even to Filipino nationals with a Chinese heritage. I argue that this narrative is comprised of several amalgamated imaginaries of China and the Chinese. One is about communist China's rise as a global superpower, and especially its increasingly assertive claims about contested territories across Asia. Second is the long-standing trope of the untrustworthy Chinaman that was born out of the physical and social exclusion of the Chinese in Manila during the almost 400 Spanish colonial regime from the 1500s to the 1800s. Third is the trope of the disloyal Chinese that is enmeshed with the complicated feelings that non-Chinese Filipinos have with the socio-economic ascent of the Filipino-Chinese community, which started from the almost 50-year American colonial period in the early to mid-1900s and continues today. This deep story of distrust towards China operates in distinct ways with those who support the Duterte government and those who oppose it. But what makes the disinformation that connects with this narrative harmful is that whether they are pro-government or critical of it, they muddy the positive value that we should associate with the notion of being anti-racist. On the one hand, the participants who are pro-government make a quick and tenuous equivalence between being supportive of the Duterte regime and themselves being better than the racist opposition, quote unquote. When faced with disinformation that supports the government stance, that the Chinese government should not at all be held responsible for the spread of COVID-19, these participants do still articulate a deep story of distrust of the Chinese government. However, they engage in mental acrobatics, very much akin to doublethink in the novel 1984. To reconcile this with Duterte's pro-China stance, Andrew, for example, says that China gave us the vaccine, but of course gave us the virus first. This is a racist sentiment, clearly couched in Filipino-style humor. But then he shifts gears and says that it's not worth thinking too much about China's faults, as that is not the most important issue anyway. And nitpicking on this issue, as is the case with what he calls trolls and anti-government commenters on Facebook especially, that's just being racist. Pro-government participants like Andrew often use this double-think defense as part of a broader strategy to shield the government from any kind of criticism. On the other hand, the participants who are critical of the government discount the anti-racism of pro-government supporters as nothing more than a product of them being blind believers of the Duterte regime. Meanwhile, they themselves work very hard to establish that they are not racist, but then sometimes reveal that they inadvertently transfer their frustration with the COVID-19 situation in the Philippines to the Chinese nationals that the government keeps on defending. To be sure, when encountering the anti-government disinformation that seeks to blame COVID-19 not only on the Chinese government, but also on Chinese nationals, they would be circumspect and make the distinction between being angry with China and being angry with the Chinese. However, there are times when their exasperation about the COVID-19 situation in the Philippines leads them to cross the line and make remarks that very subtly validate racist tirades about the Chinese nationals in the country. For instance, both Jackie and Nida say that they don't necessarily agree with the anti-government responses to the copy-paste comment I mentioned earlier about the plight of the Chinese nationals in Manila at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, Jackie says that there are valid reasons behind these sentiments. Similarly, Nida says that she understands why people express such statements. In my initial sketch of one of the deep stories underpinning how locals in Manila engage with COVID-19 related deep stories about Chinese nationals, I sought to show how such social narratives are enmeshed in complex and storied racial dynamics that underpin how Filipinos regard the Chinese. I also revealed that in weaponizing these narratives, those who support and oppose the current political dispensation in the Philippines are all implicated in amplifying the political charge of the relationship between Filipinos and Chinese. And they are at fault for undermining the value of being anti-racist. These kinds of dynamics are certainly expressed in different ways across Asia, and so eventually find themselves in the multicultural societies of the West. In thinking about disinformation, COVID-19, and racism then, we need truly global approaches that trace the transnational movements of such social dynamics. I'll end here. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to engaging with you via the comments. And of course, I'd be happy to receive emails from you as well.
So much, Jason. And I'll now play my presentation. Hi, thank you so much for joining. In this particular talk, I will talk about the ways in which the Muslim other is produced within the context of COVID-19 and how that particular production works at the intersections of disinformation and authoritarianism, particularly within the context of India. Although I will take India as an exemplar for drawing out how disinformation has been weaponized and networked within the context of COVID-19, one could perhaps see threads that flow out from this into other sides of the production of hate. The main argument being that COVID-19 has offered a context for the production and circulation of hate in digital infrastructures. So I will begin by looking at the ways in which COVID-19 has played out on the backdrop of neoliberalism, the deep inequalities that are produced by the neoliberal project, situate that in conversation with the consolidation of authoritarian power, then look at disinformation within the context of networks of hate and in dialogue with the concept of authoritarian power. Then specifically going to the context of India, we will examine the production of the Muslim other amidst COVID-19, particularly in terms of tropes that produce the Muslim other, and that serve, therefore, the broader Hindutva project, which is the consolidation of India as a Hindu nation, constructed to serve the Hindu majority, while at the same time erasing minorities, and particularly Muslim minorities. So COVID-19 plays out the violence that has been shaped by neoliberalism over the last 4 decades. And we see this in terms of the trajectories of infections of COVID-19, where COVID has disproportionately impacted the poor, the working classes, migrants, essential workers who have directly been exposed to the virus because of the essential of work of care that they perform. So neoliberal policies that have reproduced precarity through expulsions have actually placed human beings in sites of exposures to a variety of risks, including the risks of pandemic. And that's what we see play out with COVID-19. And this is organized in terms of the attacks on labor rights, unions, collectivizing capacities of workers, as well as in terms of the oppressive conditions within which workers live within spaces of capitalist extraction, all the way from lack of adequate housing to lack of decent sanitation, lack of water, lack of decent food. And these elements played out certainly in India. Many of you will be familiar with the large burdens of COVID-19 that were borne by low-wage migrant workers in India, who were expelled from cities when lockdown was first implemented in India. And these migrants were placed in pathways of risks of exposure in crowded bus stations, for instance, because the places where they were staying at, many of these places had been shut down. They were stranded without access to food and water often. So the only safe and secure place for many of these migrants seemed to be home. So you saw migrants on long walks home, replete with images of the highways, having migrant workers walking on them for kilometers in order to get home. Now, these risks in terms of trajectories of infections also then played out in terms of the effects, the unequal effects of interventions. So when the lockdown was implemented, then the effect of the lockdown was disproportionately felt by the precarious and hyper precarious classes, those without the security of a job, those without the security of access to the fundamental resources of life. So the lack of wage and income, food insecurity, barriers to accessing testing, accessing healthcare, and then being thrown into cycles of poverty because of the measures taken to prevent COVID-19. So amidst these inequalities then, the authoritarian state with its technocratic capacities emerges as a key anchor. The state becomes the infrastructure through its police, through its military, through its crisis teams to discipline the population in order to stop the spread. But also this becomes then the site for the reproduction and circulation of violence. So over the past decade or so, we have seen the consolidation of authoritarian power across the globe in terms of the rise of authoritarian figures, the rise of authoritarian parties, often appealing to um, narratives of hate in order to secure and consolidate authoritarian power. So these authoritarian structures in the midst of COVID also became the structures for implementing the practices of disciplining. In this backdrop, we see the opaqueness of decision-making processes, which is really tied to the depletion of democracies and the lack of accountability of public organizations, the depletion of trust in institutions, particularly with authoritarian figures at the helm of state structures, often gaining their authoritarian power through the questioning of expertise, while at the same time deploying their authoritarian power to implement and carry out top-down decisions. We have been seeing the depletion of trust in science and scientific organizations, in health organizations, and it is in this backdrop then we see the ways in which political profits are tied to the production of hate. The profiteering from hate becomes a way for reproducing authoritarian power. So within the context of COVID-19, then hate emerged as a key instrument for consolidating authoritarian control. And drawing on the work of Simon Springer, I see this as neoliberal violence. So violence incorporated into neoliberal structures, carried out by, supported by the state, and often through the collaboration between violent vigilante groups on one hand and the structures of the police and military on the other hand. So this is an image of Muslim worshippers in India who became sites of target of this authoritarian violence, particularly in terms of the production of these Muslim worshippers as the key sites and sources for the spread of the virus, which then legitimized the infrastructures of hate, both in terms of vigilante responses as well as in terms of state responses. So hate speech catalyzes the response of the mob, and this is often carried out through digital networks and digital structures. So hate penetrates across communities through digital technologies. In the context of India, in our work, we see this take place through the organizing infrastructure of Twitter, through the infrastructure of Facebook, and often through the infrastructure of WhatsApp, with disinformation being manufactured, images being manufactured and circulated through WhatsApp to organize hate, which then becomes a way for organizing the other in order to catalyze the authoritarian nation state. So the nation state draws its authoritarian power, its power to discipline through this production of the other as a security threat. So unprecedented physical and material violence are unleashed by the state, working alongside often the vigilante groups in order to produce security. The narrative of security becomes the precursor, becomes the legitimating tool for propping up this authoritarian structure. So disinformation is a key element of this infrastructure of hate and authoritarian control. It is through the production of disinformation, which is the strategic production and circulation of false or incorrect information. And here I want to attend to the idea of strategy. So it is through the production of disinformation that authoritarian power retains, consolidates, and further entrenches its hold on citizens. Citizens participate in their own disenfranchisement through the consumption of disinformation in order to support authoritarian strategies. So within our conversation on disinformation, that we really need to be asking this question of power. Who creates disinformation? Who distributes the disinformation, and who profits from it? Disinformation circulates because it is profitable, because it generates both economically, financially, it generates profits, but also generates political capital for authoritarian structures. So in India, then, this climate of disinformation is shaped by the supremacy of Hindutva. Hindutva is an ideology that imagines India as a Hindu nation. Of course, this work of imagining India as a masculine Hindu nation draws upon strategies of violence to assert Hindu supremacy. And often this is done through the production of the other, the Muslim other, the Muslim invader that invaded that country. So that narrative is reproduced on an ongoing basis in order to produce this hate and in order to then create the necessary material infrastructures to build India as a Hindu nation. So the supremacy of the Hindutva ideology operates on this continuing production of the Muslim other. Hindutva needs to produce the Muslim other in order to sustain itself. So here you see this image. This is a fairly popular image that is circulated by the followers of Hindutva, and it's an image of Lord Hanuman, recreated as the warrior lord who is going to protect the dignity of the nation, the dignity of the Hindus from the Muslim invaders. So a militant Hanuman equipped with the powers of violence, is integral to protecting and safeguarding the nation. So Hindutva supremacy needs images like this to articulate a politics of security and safety. So I quickly wanted to go back to this image. This is, an image of supporters of Bajrang Dal, which is one of the many outfits of Hindutva. You have the Bajrang Dal, you have the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh or the RSS, which works through this catalysis of violence, which works to recruit grassroots volunteers under the narrative of violence necessary to protect the nation, protect the Hindu nation from the onslaughts of marauders and colonizers, particularly Muslim colonizers. So Islamophobia in that sense is the heart of the Hindutva project and its politics of hate. So the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh is a non-voluntary, it's a non-profit voluntary organization that works through various voluntary activities, activities of service, or what are called activities of seva, in order to recruit participants in this politics of hate and in order to find its inroads across communities in India. Across eastern part of Bengal, in indigenous communities, in Dalit or oppressed caste communities where I have been doing a lot of my work. I see the ongoing efforts of Hindutva, particularly through RSS, to build camps, to build educational opportunities, to build agricultural projects, and through that process then recruiting communities into the underlying ideology of hate. At the heart of Hindutva then, to prop up that Hindu nation, is the idea of eliminating the Muslim. And this process of eliminating the Muslim happens through the marking of the Muslim other, which becomes a basis for deployment of violence on the streets. Since the election of the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is part of this Hindutva outfit, over the last really about 7 years, we have seen ongoing acts of violence that take forms all the way from streets, through vigilante justice, through attacks on Muslims for eating beef, to the organizing of the police to carry out pogroms targeting Muslims. And all of this is connected by the marking of the Muslim other. That becomes a basis for the deployment of the violence. And then that becomes a basis for both catalyzing riots and pogroms. So these two elements, riots and pogroms, form the infrastructure of the violent machinery of Hindutva. So how then does this connect to COVID-19? Amidst COVID-19, then, this Hindutva apparatus in India organized hate by planting disinformation around Muslims, by specifically crafting this narrative that Muslims are intentionally distributing the coronavirus as a terrorist strategy that want to dismantle the safety, the security, the peace of India. And this narrative then becomes the way for the organizing of hate across digital platforms. In order to produce this narrative, various forms of disinformation need to be created, all the way from lifting images, lifting videos from different points of time and time stamping them as videos amidst COVID in order to generate the fear, to manipulating and morphing images and videos, to crafting stories around videos to build this narrative of hate. So one of the important incidences that happened in the early part of COVID in India, so we are really talking about the month of March in 2020, is that a Muslim faith-based group called Tablighi Jamaat, which has a long history in India, particularly with the question of Muslim identity amidst British colonialism. And Tablighi Jamaat started as a movement for imagining and interpreting Muslim identity amidst British colonialism. And Tablighi Jamaat has since grown globally, having presence across the globe. And then it organizes meetings in different parts of the world as part of having these conversations. So in early March, Tablighi Jamaat met in New Delhi, bringing in grassroots workers, activists, faith seekers from various parts of the world, and certainly many different parts of Asia, into New Delhi. Once the conference, and this is, mind you, really in terms of lockdown and when COVID-19 came into visibility in India around the end of March, right, around March 24th or so. This is before that. This is the early part of March. And then most Tablighi Jamaat participants that had come from other parts of the world had gone back to where they came from. A small number had stayed back, small compared to the total number of participants in the events, had stayed back, and then a smaller number even were stranded once the lockdown was announced in India. Now, around the Tablighi Jamaat, then the narrative started being created around Muslims being dirty, and Tablighi Jamaat spreading across the country in order to spread coronavirus, and them being the sources and the hotspots of COVID in India. So this became the way for manufacturing the narrative of Muslims as dangerous, as carriers of the virus, thus weaponizing the virus to carry out this politics of hate, and producing the Muslim terror. So the narrative of the Tablighi Jamaat as terrorists intentionally weaponizing the virus to spread it and to attack Hindus became the prominent narrative spread through digital platforms. Platforms such as Corona Jihad, Nizamuddin Idiot, these are hashtags on Twitter, became viral. They started developing large numbers of tweets under them, with a great deal of virality being shared by people, not only within the platform, but across platforms. So with large mobility from one platform to other. So a tweet, for instance, would share an image, which would then be downloaded and shared via WhatsApp. So this kind of cross-platform networking became a key element in the circulation of hate. Most of these images were manufactured, videos were manipulated, such as videos of restaurant workers spitting into the food. And then these videos started circulating, saying that this is how Muslims are attacking Hindus and are wanting to spread the virus. When fact-checked, it turned out that the videos that were circulating, most of them were taken much before the outbreak. Most of them were taken in different contexts, in different places, and also that the videos and their purposes had been manipulated. So, for instance, there was a fruit seller who was seen in a video spitting on food or using his saliva to wipe the food. It later turns out that that video was from before the outbreak, but also that the man had mental health challenges that he was negotiating. But these pieces of disinformation then, with change dates and time frames to create a particular narrative of the Muslim terrorist using the virus to attack the nation, circulated on Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, building this digital network of hate. And the key point to remember here is that this digital network of hate then worked alongside mainstream media production. So mainstream news organizations picked up those stories and further fed into the virality of these stories, working to catalyze hate, to circulate fear, and to generate and to mobilize public participation around the authoritarian impulses of the state. So this kind of fear and hate then worked to consolidate police repression. We have seen in our field work multiple accounts of repression targeting migrant workers. We have had Muslim participants in our field work who have talked about being targeted for repression by the police. And here, as I was saying earlier, vigilante violence works alongside police violence. And as this is going on, dissent is criminalized. Just last year, we saw over 30 academics and activists being jailed across India for protesting against the Islamophobic Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register for Citizens, which are organizing mechanisms created by the state to dispossess Muslims. At the same time, terror is weaponized in order to consolidate this authoritarian power. So Hindutva amidst COVID-19 becomes a site for consolidation through the reworking of disinformation. Disinformation specifically works to consolidate authoritarian power, and at the same time, it works to draw attention away from the failures of the authoritarian government of Narendra Modi. In fact, subsequent reports have pointed to the failures in the implementation of the lockdown that place so many migrant workers into these networks of COVID risk, without giving adequate notice and without giving them time to prepare and without consideration of the infrastructures necessary for them. But these failures become covered up with the story of hate, which actually further works to reproduce those authoritarian strategies of deploying police, deploying violence to silence dissent. So in this talk, I covered the ways in which Islamophobia was organized amidst COVID. And what I would like you to really think through is the ways in which health risks are produced, the narratives of health risks are produced in order to consolidate the infrastructures of hate. Thank you. Back to you.
Oh, so that was really wonderful. I mean, I read the transcript and I watched some of it when the uploads were completed, but I actually got an opportunity to do the entire run through this time. It is really our papers have a lot of things in common, and then our papers also have they were written somewhere around October and now we are in May and things are playing out in ways that we were predicting, and it's quite frightening in some places, and then things have not played out in some other ways, and that's good. So I want to, since this is like a live, many of the people are students, and they are live and they signed up for this. I want to give them an opportunity to ask questions for all three of us, or even if you want to have your own point of view and you're thinking about how these things are playing out in your own places and spaces and with your own people. We would love to hear from you. So take it away with your questions. And of course, Usha is here and she will be moderating some of the questions, I'm thinking, and she might have some questions of her own, given that India is now going through its second devastating phase and with no end in sight. So yes, please.
Thank you, Sudeshna. So maybe just before we open it up to questions, I can just say a few things. And thanks for this panel, really interesting viewpoints. And again, like you said, I was struck by the narrative thread, right, that connects all the three presentations. So whether we're talking about the right-wing consolidation of power through a narrative against immigration, or again, the consolidation of power through a narrative against a certain ethnic other, in the case of the Philippines, or Islamophobia in the case of India. And I was really struck that this is not a new narrative, right? I mean, if you look historically, whether we're looking at the plague, the Spanish flu, we have seen that borders have intensified every time there is a pandemic that crosses borders. So the first response by states has been to fix blame and then to shut down borders in response to who they think is to blame. And of course, in the instances that you describe, it isn't always a shutting of national borders, but it's sort of creating an intensification of borders within countries as well. So I remember reading in the early days of the pandemic about the creation of Black Town in Mumbai after the plague in Mumbai, and how that very clearly demarcated the colonizers, the expatriate British population and the native population. And that was a certain kind of border building, right? A barrier building. And we see the same sort of trope repeating itself in contemporary times. And I think, Mohan talked about Islamophobia and the characterization of the Tablighi Jamaat as a super spreader event. And in the chat box, people were commenting about the Kumbh Mela and how that was characterized differently by the mainstream media. I mean, although there was criticism, I think from the criticism was from civil society. It wasn't so much from the state. And more recently, there was the use of the word super spreader in relation to health workers, particularly health workers at the lowest rung, right? ASHA workers, and so on. So, when we think about, assigning blame to a community on the one hand, and assigning blame to those who are disadvantaged in other ways, the first response of the state, particularly of right-wing governments, has been to apportion blame and therefore take away from the responsibility of the state in providing care. So it's a move of, or it's a transformation of a discourse of that should be of something that should be a discourse of care into a discourse of blame, which uses tropes of othering, of identifying certain communities that have historically been seen as somehow inimical to the nation, to the imagination of the nation. One thing that struck me in Jason's paper, for instance, about deep stories, and I think again that's something that found resonance in what Mohan was talking about, in that COVID-19 has allowed the state to make use of these deep stories. And I think that's a great way to think about it, right? I mean, these deep stories exist in India, for instance. And that deep story of Islamophobia had been stoked during the CAA protests over November, December, January. And so when COVID happened in March, it was very easy to connect Islamophobia to that deep story of othering of Muslims that has always existed. So I think, yeah, these, all the papers really bring out in a very depressing way a story that is not new. But in doing so, then in revealing how the media or how the state discourse does this, maybe that's a way forward. And I think, Sudeshna kind of ended on a hopeful note by saying, if we adopt a care-centered approach, whether it is within the space of health communication or within the state, within the space of telling stories through journalism, that could be a way forward. So I'll stop there. But again, thanks very much for the 3 papers, and maybe if there are additional questions. And just to open it up, the one question I had was about this, the tension between identifying groups of individuals, as in the case of India, like, we're talking about frontline healthcare workers, or very often workers like domestic workers or labor, even if they were not migrant, were often seen as the source of infection, and therefore gated communities, other kinds of enclosed spaces often put up their own barricades, not realizing often that the infections were within rather than coming from these populations. So there is, on the one hand, this kind of assigning blame, right, to groups of individuals, not necessarily marked by ethnicity or religion, but by class, let's say, and the sort of ethnic religion-based discourses that you all have pointed to. So how does one look, do we look at those differently, or what are the deep stories that exist in the case of individual or class-based groups? So any of you who want to pick up on that?
Well, I just have a comment with regard to the question that you just asked. I feel that whenever we are making a distinction or trying to figure out a class-based aspect of discrimination, the lower the class perceptively or perceptually, there are more intersectional identities that are associated with those classes. So historically, Muslims do straddle the lower classes that are then, not only punished by the state, but are punished within the class system in different formats. I'm specifically talking about India. I would love to hear, what Mohan and Jace thinks about this.
If I may jump in, I want to thank my two co-panelists as well, because listening to your presentations made me think really hard about, like Sudeshna said, this was written last year, and listening to your two presentations, I need to push this idea a little bit further from what I presented actually. And what I'm thinking is actually in terms of how intersectional the deep story in the Philippines is. It goes beyond the story of the relationship between Filipinos and Chinese, I think. So if I'm allowed to explain a little bit, I think the broader transnational thing that's going on, a transnational deep story that's going on. And I think it has to do with this link between coloniality and class that our authoritarian government is exploiting. That their choice to actually appear to be not racist towards the Chinese, I think, is part of a bigger ploy towards authoritarian solidarity. That it's really, they're trying to express an anti-colonial stance, anti-colonial meaning against the West, and using also their connections with the working class who feel that because of globalization and neoliberalism, they've been excluded in so many ways. And so the pro-China stance, the seeming defense of the Chinese nationals here, I think connects with this bigger story of they're trying to be anti-colonial and trying to be for the working class because precisely they're authoritarian and don't want to be held responsible by civil society, by the norms of a global society. And they're trying to, in a way, be in solidarity with China, that you cannot check us from the outside. On the other hand, unfortunately, I think our opposition, this anti-Chinese sentiment shows the limits of if our government is trying to be anti-colonial, our opposition being liberal technocrats are often geared towards globalization and cosmopolitanism, but in a very Western kind of neoliberal way. And the Chinese are not part of that imaginary because they're so oriented still towards the West. And it's the middle class in the Philippines that are pushing for this. And so that's why you see that spillover of the racist sentiments. So I think this is something worth developing. But again, thank you very much to my two co-panelists and to Usha as well for pushing me to think about this a little bit more. So hopefully a future version of the paper can elaborate on this.
I just want to briefly add, I mean, there's so much that you pointed out, Sudeshna and Jason, and to what you said, Usha. And what I want to add is that precisely picking on Jason's point, that sort of the construction of the intersections, particularly in terms of religion, caste, social class, as strategies of boundary making, seems to be very much embedded within the contemporary context of the neoliberal project in India. So the marking of the inside and the outside and the boundary management that you're seeing at the national level is also what you're seeing reflected at the meso and the micro levels, all the way to the gated communities, you know. So in some of our ethnographic work, going back to Sudeshna's point, in fact, we had been interviewing Bengali Muslim workers who had traveled to Noida and Ghaziabad to work. And, you know, one of the things that their narratives point to is how quickly amidst COVID, and this was, of course, in the backdrop of the CA and NRC protests that were taking place in December, January, February, Usha, as you pointed out, is that the narratives quickly turned to the Bangladeshi. You know, they were quickly framed and made into Bangladeshi as the infiltrator, the migrant infiltrator, that is threatening again. So I think that also exacerbated these processes of exclusion, you know, and hate. I also wanted to add something to what Vinod has said here, is that there is historically precedence, Usha, as you're saying, but it also seems that this was exacerbated particularly the virality, because of social media and its interplays with traditional and mainstream media and the ways in which they're amplifying the hate, you know?
Yeah, I mean, the amplification factor is really quite frightening in its exponential capabilities, especially in a country like India, where every other person has downloaded WhatsApp on their phones. And, you know, these, if there is a story that is circulating, it circulates really quickly. I mean, it is on my mom, who cannot operate the mobile phone, even if her life depended on it, knows how to share and forward a story on WhatsApp to me. And that just shows you, I mean, my mom is absolutely not technologically savvy, but she knows that much. And I will get these weird videos and weird memes, and I'm like, how are you doing this? Where are you getting this from? Who is sending this to you? And that's where, you know, the frightening aspect of this is that, you know, she will tell me things, I'm like, that's not true. And she was like, no, I got it on WhatsApp. I mean, there is no power beyond the WhatsApp group that she believes in. She really believes in that group. So it is a very difficult situation, this power of amplification that we are talking about, especially as it regards to how they implicate the racial, ethnic minorities, class minorities, intersectional minorities in so many different ways. One in the WhatsApp university is what is what Devina is talking about. I do want to point to one thing. You know, we are talking about discourses, right? Discourses of power, discourses of state discipline. But there is also a possibility of the discourse being used by the others. So in this case, I would like to point out that the way Donald Trump used COVID-19 to disenfranchise so many different groups, specifically with regard to, you know, his immigration policy and things like that, there was an oppositional discourse that took root. And that's probably one of the reasons why he was voted out of office. So I feel that even though we are talking about the amplification, the power of amplification also lies on the other side as well. And, you know, some hope in the discourse from the margins.
Sorry, go ahead, Jason.
Oh, all right, you can go ahead. And then
No, I was just saying that there are several comments in the chat, so it would be nice if the commenters actually jumped in and raised questions. But maybe first, Jason, you should complete your thought.
I just wanted to connect with what Sudeshna was saying about how the others also create a quote unquote a discourse. And one of the things is that I think there's the nuance there is that on the one hand, there are solidarities that are created, and that's great. And I think that's one of the reasons precisely why I feel very envious of the US at the moment with this much needed win, I think, for the global community. But at the same time, I also see that, and this is, I'm drawing on actually a longer experience. I myself being I used to be a migrant living in the UK as a scholar there before coming home here. And I could see sometimes that there are two modes of relating with fellow migrants, that it could be a bonding of solidarity, but also sometimes how migrants unfortunately turn on each other in a bid to kind of like it's a contest of who is more acceptable, who is deserving to stay in this country. And what I've seen, I haven't studied this systematically, but it breaks my heart seeing how Filipinos, for example, in the US, their reaction to the anti-Chinese sentiments that Trump drummed up was not Asian solidarity, but I'm not Chinese. I shouldn't be part of that. It's supposed to be the Chinese who are to be blamed and not us other Asians. I mean, why Americans need to know the difference between Koreans and Chinese and Filipino and just blame the Chinese. And to me, that was very heartbreaking because the reaction was not of solidarity, but even further othering within already these communities. And I think that the thing that Sudeshna is pointing out is what needs to be amplified actually is the more positive forms of solidarity.
Yeah, I know that's a great point. And I, just said in the chat that you see this kind of distancing from the marked other in many parts of the world, right? So the moment you see a possibly, identifiable community as being marked as other, you want to say, no, that's not me. But yeah, that's kind of a sad thing. Yes, Vinod, would you like to jump in with any comments? Let's see. Yeah.
One thing that Chinar has mentioned here in the chat is that she says that, as in the case of my family, they get a lot of misinformation from what I consider to be religious WhatsApp groups, circles which were not even in existence before the pandemic. I mean, that's a very critical point, right? How were these groups able to coalesce and spread their disinformation and whatever information they think is necessary to be spread, and how were they able to then attract the attention of the commoner? Every other person seems to be getting something on WhatsApp from one or the other group. Can we talk about that a little bit within the context of, especially because it was not that prevalent before pandemic? How has the pandemic helped in making these types of networks possible? Mohan, did you have any?
I mean, quickly, I just wanted to say, at least in our field work, what we see is that a lot of people have more time amidst the pandemic. There is a lot of time that has been freed up to circulate information, but also, what relates to that is that people are looking for certainty. So all the way from, you should go out in the sun and expose yourself to the sun, drink lemon water, those kinds of prescriptions to hate. And, you see, this is how these are all intertwined with each other. Those groups really form a particular utilitarian function in terms of offering advice, offering social support, getting to occupy your time.
Yeah, and just to kind of, speak to that point, I think there are, communities of practice, strange kinds of communities of practice, right? So you'll find groups that are, that gather around, let's say, environmental issues or, Ayurveda or holistic medicine, whatever. And I think, many of you use the word weaponized. And I think often what happens is that these communities of practice, which were earlier not seen as political necessarily, then become weaponized by a few within that group for the purposes of inserting this kind of discourse of hate. So yes, you might be in a yoga group that also looks at naturotherapy and so on and so forth. Very quickly that shifts to introducing the kind of conversation that you're talking about, right? So I think I don't know that, I'm sure there must be work that looks at this, how existing communities of supposedly apolitical practice then become weaponized. Yeah.
Stephen, go ahead, Jason, and then we have Stephen in this room who was going to say something.
Oh, great. Okay.
Just to add, I think it's really quite curious, and I'm personally very curious because in the Philippines, the way that this information spreads, like Chinar said, is also through the WhatsApp groups. And religious groups specifically. So I find it quite fascinating that there is a parallel across these different contexts. And what we found a lot of the disinformation that we found here, particularly with health disinformation and about COVID-19, has been passed on through these WhatsApp groups. But just also to say that in the work that I've done in terms of disinformation production, we've had an opportunity previously to talk to disinformation producers in the Philippines. This was around 2016, 2017 at the very start of the election of President Duterte. Since then, the trolls have not talked to us because I think there's an order from above not to talk to scholars anymore. But the first year or so, they were very open talking about their techniques. And towards the end of 2019, when the last communication we had with them, they were specifically talking about targeting these groups, mirroring the techniques of the ad and PR industries of like super bespoke kinds of communication. And it's easier to create these very tailored forms of this information if you're not targeting everyone, you're just targeting very specific groups of people. So this is really a trend going into the smaller groups, and it's scary. And also, I guess, I don't know what Mohan and Sudeshna have to say about this. It's harder to study because how do you get into these groups and look at their operations when the trolls at the start were very generous and opening up their accounts to us, but now we're not able to see that. So these are very scary developments, I think.
Stephen? Yeah.
I just want to thank everyone, first of all. That was really, really, really interesting. And also, it's really very closely linked to research that we're doing, looking at prejudice and blame attribution during COVID-19. But we're approaching it from a very different point of view. Our research group very much so looking at very social scientific, looking at things such as intergroup contact, integrated threat theory, so using large-scale survey data. But what's been interesting is looking at from this point of view has really helped me also. Just had a student finish their master's in data analytics. And what was interesting, just to think about this, kind of put it out there for folks, they did a sentiment analysis of Morrison, Trudeau, Johnson, and Trump and their Twitter usage. And Trump's Twitter use from January 1st to December 20th, 2020, it wasn't as negative as you would think when it came to virus or COVID. Only about 22% of the references were actually negative, and actually wasn't too much different than all the other world leaders. So actually about almost 78% was actually positive or neutral when it came to virus and COVID. And so I think it'd be interesting to combine the different methodological approaches where we, from a discourse point of view, assume that, or I'm not saying that you're assuming, but or anyone assumes, but to look at really what is actually said on Twitter and the frequency, especially since Trump was using Twitter as his main platform, not the White House, is really looking at really how the frequency is actually a lot lower. And if you look to the number of tweets, we're probably only looking at about 25 to 30 tweets throughout the year that were actually negative, and that's it when it came to COVID. That's just one world leader, and the others were very similar. Very few tweets, and that's just one form of social media, were actually negative statistically. And that's a whole sentiment analysis, and that's kind of intriguing to see. Yeah. So I think bringing in different methodological approaches, and this was scraping all of Twitter and actually seeing, even looking at the responses to people, how people responded, it was still less than 25%, about 22.6%, which is really kind of cool to see. So I just thought I'd point that out there. I think bringing in those different methodological approaches could also inform. So what you're saying here, I think, will inform us as we look at the sentiment analysis and look at the natural language processing. It'll help us kind of too.
Can I just say something that struck me very quickly before, there are a few more questions in the chat box. But I'm just wondering that, it's really interesting what you said about what emerges in this kind of in a sentiment analysis of the tweets themselves. But if we combine that with the notion of deep stories and how communities of followers actually use those few negative messages, we might get some sense of what is going on out there. So,
I agree 100%. That's why I'm thinking merging kind of these
Yes.
mixed methods would be really kind of cool. So that's why I'm really thankful for hearing these today. It can really help, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a question from Isha in the chat box, and she says, with the amplification of misinformation on more or less every media platform, is there any platform we will finally trust now that the government of India has new IT rules, IT laws? Where does the media go from here? Any thoughts on that from the panel?
We know this.
Yes, Vinod. Yes.
Yes. No, I think one of the things that we found over the last year or two, at least definitely since the beginning of the pandemic, is that there has been a tremendous amount of pushback on disinformation and misinformation from community-based media. And we have been documenting the work of community radios across the world. And this past year, we've found some fascinating things emerging from Latin America, parts of Africa, India, of course, where a couple of hundred community radio stations, very localized kind of pockets of resistance to misinformation and disinformation in local languages, local dialects, and community-generated information to counter the misinformation. I mean, there was one radio station in rural Haryana which ran a program called 21 Din 21 Baatein, 21 days, 21 things to talk about during the last national lockdown in India. So every day they would take up one major misinformation and disinformation and address that throughout the day with community voices pushing back on this. So yeah, I mean, I'm conscious of the relative power of these community media outlets, but let's not also completely undermine or neglect these little pockets of resistance that we find. Yeah.
What a great point, Vinod, and that's really what the inspiration and the hope is. And then goes back to Sudeshna's point also, I think, in terms of voices and the possibilities of resistance. And what you're saying is that there is already that resistance, in many forms in communities.
Yeah, and how does one then amplify that, right? Might be a question. Yeah. So I realize that we're at 10:30. Isn't that
Yes.
the end of the session? So any final comments from the panelists? And I will hand it back to you. Yeah.
Can I please ask a question? I'm sorry. One last question.
That's up to Sudeshna and Mohan. Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead, Davina. Yes.
Thank you. Sorry. So I wanted to ask you to tell us more about how early career researchers could probably get into projects like these, because there's so much on the line. On one hand, you're talking about really vulnerable populations, and then on the other hand, you do in a way stand up against certain authorities, which can be a little difficult, especially if you're just starting out in your career. So just some advice for us.
From my end, what I can say, Davina, is that this project on disinformation and all the hatred and vitriol that it's creating, I don't think I could have done it alone. I was working with a team. And I think that's very, very crucial, especially when you're talking to the actual disinformation producers, talking to politicians, funding them, etc., and then coming out with public reports about that. I think solidarity in academia is very important. So we were a team working on this project, and we had junior scholars working with us as well. So I think it's worth being part of a network like that. So that also one of the things we constantly did this after every stressful interview, we would check on each other. Are you okay emotionally, mentally, especially with our younger colleagues as well in the team. But obviously even us, the older members of the team were very affected by the things that we were hearing. So I think working in a team would be very, very helpful when it comes to these high stress topics and crossing the line and then listening to people on the other side whom you might not necessarily agree with. So that would be my take. Thank you.
I mean, from my side, I mean, I'm leaving the best for the last. Mohan can, speak to you about his experiences. But from my side, I would say that specifically, I was a single mother in a different culture in the United States for many, many years. I did not, not only did I not have the resources and the access to the different types of populations. I had so many restrictions. I couldn't go anywhere because of my kids and things like that. So I started with, I mean, you were asking for strategies. This may or may not apply to you. There are several ways to help as an advocate, as an activist, as a scholar. And you can start with secondary data as well. You do not need to collect primary data in order to make a difference, in order to make a point, in order to publish heavily. You can start with secondary data. I mean, coming from me, I'm not as prolific as Dr. Dutta, but, I have made contributions that are worth contributing and people appreciate that. And I think that the contribution that I have made definitely works towards helping marginalized populations, wherever they are. So you can definitely start from, I mean, this is just my personal experience. You can start from secondary data, analyze them. I mean, primary data is the best, but primary data also comes with, a lot of sacrifices and not everybody is in a position to make that at those points in their lives.
Yeah. Sudeshna and Jason, first of all, I just want to say, I see you do such important work. So Sudeshna, please don't say this. I think you have really done such vital work in building registers. And that's really at the heart of transformation. I also want to say, Devina, that's such a powerful question. And you look at Usha and you look at Vinod, your own professors, in terms of the registers that they are building, and those are great examples. I also want to say, when responding to your question, I'm very aware of my own privilege and different positions of privilege, but also the real risks of doing this work within the context of India. And I will just share a small anecdote. Last time I was in Hyderabad while doing the field work, and somebody, got on my Facebook Messenger and told me that I am on an IB list and I should be careful. So that really gets at the heart of this idea that we have to be very mindful of the risks we are around. And that's why, I had the slide about 30 or so academics, being in jail at this point in India. So you have to be really careful if you're doing any primary work. That is the first thing we would say. Right now, as we speak, we have one of our Rohingya community researchers who has been in jail in Hyderabad. And we think that he's COVID infected, and we are just scrambling to get legal help for him. So I think that there are real consequences. You have to be very, very careful. Having said that, I think that, Sudeshna's idea of doing secondary work based upon secondary research, you can do, for instance, analysis of Twitter feeds and Facebook feeds and groups and WhatsApp messages. Those are really important pieces of work. I also want to suggest what Jason said in terms of building networks of solidarity and working in large teams. One of the things in my work I say is that build multiple nodes of resistance, so that you have many nodes of resistance. And if the structure clamps down, you can point to somebody else, and being really creative about it and anticipating that in terms of building a wide network. But also the third thing I want to say is in terms of the preparedness of how you share the work. I think that it is safe to publish the work in journals in most instances. It is safe to publish the work in book chapters and books, more or less. What is unsafe is when you actually make it public. or when you go into Twitter and Facebook with this work, as you can see many examples of that. So I would, caution junior scholars to be really mindful about what you share publicly and consider that safety,
So thank you all so much. And I give it over to Mohan or Sudeshna to close the panel.
And I would rather that Jason Mohan close the panel because I started it. And may I just say that I'm really honored that I was made part of this hybrid as well as joint panel. This is so awesome. I can't believe that we were able to, connect across. How many time zones are we talking about? New Zealand, Philippines, India, and the US. This is amazing, amazing. Devina, Usha, thank you for the opportunity. So happy.
Yeah, no, and, thank you. Thank you all.
Let's Jason Mohan, finish it.
Jason, how about you? You wrap us up.
I would just like to thank everyone who organized this event. Like Sudeshna said, I think it's not an easy thing to do this across many different time zones, but I think it's super worth doing it. Also to be able to listen to our differently placed research and stories and to find the connections, to find the links, and to, in some ways, what I take out really is to take heart in the hope that because we are able to listen to each other, we find the solidarity there. And we also find, like with what Vinod said earlier, like the little pockets of resistance that we can really draw on. We haven't thought of that here in the Philippines. And I'm like, we should do that also, the community kinds of communications. I think by talking to each other, it sounds, like, for lack of a better word, the best practices to kind of challenge these very global problems that we have. I think this is such a great opportunity to explore those. So thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.